You ever catch a glimpse of yourself in a movie or maybe a TV show
Yeah.
and just feel like it's only showing one tiny bit of who you actually are?
Oh, absolutely.
Like there's this whole other complex thing going on, all these experiences and parts of your identity that just, aren't reflected at all.
Yeah, that feeling of being only partially seen or maybe even misunderstood, that's a really good starting point for what we're digging into today.
Because the reality is, right, we all navigate the world with these multiple layers,
Yeah.
different parts of who we are.
Exactly. And how those layers interact, how they overlap, well, that creates experiences that can be profoundly different for different people.
So, to get a handle on this, there's this concept, intersectionality.
That's the key term. Yeah. At its core, it's about recognizing that different parts of our identity, think race, gender, class, sexuality, they don't exist in isolation. They can and do overlap.
Okay, overlap. And when they do,
Well, that overlap can create really unique, sometimes compounded experiences. Could be discrimination, could be privilege, or is often a mix. It's not just facing, say, racism and sexism separately.
right.
It's how those forces interact to create something distinct, a specific kind of experience because of that intersection.
Okay, I get it. So let's really unpack this, and our main guide for this exploration is the incredible bell hooks.
Hmm.
And just a reminder for everyone, she preferred her name written in lowercase.
A vital point. Yeah, bell hooks. A truly important African-American academic, writer, activist. I mean, she was absolutely central in developing intersectional theory.
Especially thinking about how race and gender connect with, well, what we see all around us in the media.
Precisely. And what's so crucial about Hook's work is how she really zeroed in on the experiences of Black women. She powerfully argued that their lived realities were often just silenced or completely ignored, both in academic work and in media portrayal.
Right, like their specific intersection wasn't being seen.
Exactly. Her point was if we don't look at how these different oppressions, race, gender, class intersect, we're missing a huge piece of the picture, especially for understanding Black women's lives.
Makes total sense. So the mission for this deep dive then is to really explore bell hook's perspective on this intersectional oppression, specifically how it plays out in the media we all consume.
Right. We want to understand why looking through this lens, this intersectional framework, is just so essential for anyone, really, who wants a proper understanding of how media shapes our worldview and even how we see ourselves.
Okay, so where do we start with Hook's analysis? What's foundational?
Well, a really foundational point in her work is that these different systems, racism, sexism, classism, they aren't separate problems operating independently.
Right.
She argued they're deeply interconnected. They actually stem from a shared root system, a system of white, male-dominated power.
Interconnected, okay. And she looked back historically to trace this, didn't she?
She did. It becomes really clear when you look at it through the lens she used, particularly looking back at something as foundational and horrific as slavery in the United States.
Right. How did she see those systems working together there? Can you walk us through that?
Sure. So during slavery, Black women were fundamentally treated as property, not as human beings.
Just objects.
Objects, yes. Forced into brutal labor, obviously, but also their bodies were instrumentalized, used specifically for the reproduction of more enslaved people to increase the slave owners' wealth.
Horrifying.
And this total lack of bodily autonomy meant they were systematically subjected to just horrific sexual violence, mostly by white slave owners and overseers.
With absolutely no legal recourse.
None whatsoever. Any resistance, even perceived resistance, was met with extreme brutality. They had no protection under the law.
And Hooks also made a really difficult point, didn't she, about the role of some white women in this system.
Yes, that's a crucial and deeply uncomfortable part of the analysis. The complicity of some white women, the wives of slave owners. Well, it suggests that some either, condone this abuse or maybe even participated in perpetuating it, perhaps as a way to sort of shore up their own, quite frankly, precarious position within that very unequal social structure. It's complex.
Wow, okay. And because of this treatment, this commodification and abuse.
Exactly. Because of the roles they were forced into and the constant violence they faced, Black women were systematically denied any access to the dominant white ideals of, purity, femininity, or morality.
Which led to stereotype.
Precisely. It led to the creation and embedding of this deeply harmful stereotype. The idea that Black women were somehow inherently impure or naturally sexual, almost bestial.
And that stereotype served a purpose.
A perverse justification, yes. It dehumanized them, making the horrific abuse they suffered seem somehow acceptable, or even natural within that twisted logic.
And the crucial argument Hooks made is that these images, these justifications, they didn't just vanish when slavery ended.
Not at all. That's central to her work. She showed how these historical stereotypes have had this incredibly long afterlife. They continue to shape, really profoundly, how Black women are represented in media today.
So you still see echoes of this stuff now?
Absolutely. You look at TV, film, music videos, Black women are still frequently hypersexualized, or they get confined to these really narrow, negative boxes.
Like what?
Like the stereotype of the prostitute, or the angry Black woman, or, the subservient maid or servant figure. It's quite striking how persistent these tropes are, even if they morph slightly over time.
It's also interesting how Hooks pointed out the underrepresentation overall, especially compared to Black men in media.
Yes. That's a key point. It almost creates this dynamic where Black masculinity can sometimes end up standing in for the entire Black community experience in media narratives.
Leaving Black women sort of invisible.
Invisible, or their specific experiences and perspectives just aren't centered. They become secondary or flattened.
And this connects to broader beauty standards too, right?
Right. Definitely. Connect this to the bigger picture, you still see a real dominance of white beauty standards in mainstream media. Think magazine covers, advertising.
So,
oh yeah, Black women's features, diverse body types, they're often still presented as other or maybe exotic rather than just part of the norm, part of the standard of beauty.
do we have any data on this representation gap?
We do. There was a UCLA study looking at the 2016-2017 US TV season, I think. It found something like 469 lead roles for white men.
Okay.
And 319 for white women, then 85 for Black men, and an even lower number for Black women in lead roles. It paints a stark picture of that imbalance.
Wow. Okay. So Hooks didn't just talk generally. She identified specific damaging stereotypes that keep popping up. Let's look at those.
Right. She named them. One really harmful one is the Jezebel.
The Jezebel. What's that?
This is the image of the Black woman as inherently over-sexualized, seductive, maybe predatory, promiscuous. It's an old trope, but you still see versions of it all the time, especially maybe in music videos or certain film genres.
Okay, the Jezebel. What else?
Then there's the Aunt Jemima, or the mammy figure. Completely different, almost the opposite in some ways.
Right, I know that image.
The loyal, often depicted as overweight, and crucially, desexualized or asexual Black woman. Usually a domestic servant devoted to the white family she served. Hugely popular in mid-20th century film and TV.
Okay, Jezebel, Mammy.
Yeah.
Any others?
And the third key one she identified is the sapphire.
Sapphire.
This is the stereotype of the angry, loud, aggressive, maybe emasculating Black woman, often used for comedic effect, unfortunately, or in reality TV, portrays Black women as inherently confrontational or unlikable.
Wow. So Jezebel, Mammy, Sapphire, very different on the surface.
Seemingly different, yeah. But what Hooks argued is that they all function to limit and dehumanize. They simplify and distort the reality of Black women's lives, as she put it.
Reducing complex people to caricatures.
Exactly. Just flat, one-dimensional caricatures that serve a particular social purpose, usually reinforcing existing power structures. And tragically, Hooks also believed that some Black women had actually internalized some of these negative images.
Internalized them. How?
Well, constantly seeing yourself reflected through these distorted lenses can really impact your own sense of self, your identity, your worth. It's insidious.
That's heavy. And this leads to another really important part of her critique, doesn't it? Looking at the feminist movement itself.
Yes. Because while feminism aimed for equality between men and women, Hooks offered a really significant critique of what she called white feminism.
White feminism. Okay, what was her issue there?
Her core argument was that this dominant stream of feminism often failed to acknowledge the specific experiences of Black women, or sometimes it even actively ignored them. It didn't account for that intersection of race and gender.
Can you give some examples, historically?
Sure. If you look back at the women's suffrage movement, say in the 1920s in the U.S., white suffragettes often actively excluded Black women from their organizations and marches.
Really? Why?
Often out of fear of alienating Southern white voters, or simply because their priority was votes for white women, not necessarily universal suffrage. Race was seen as a complication.
Wow. Okay. Any other examples?
Well, later, during the second wave of feminism, the 1960s and 70s, many prominent feminist thinkers tended to focus heavily on the experiences and concerns of white middle-class women.
Like workplace equality or reproductive rights from that specific perspective.
Exactly. Discussions about race, or class for that matter, were often sidestepped or seen as, again, potentially divisive to the movement's main goals, which were implicitly defined by white women's experiences.
So what was the result of that exclusion?
The direct consequence was that many black women felt alienated. They felt marginalized within the movement that was supposed to be about women's liberation.
Like it wasn't their liberation being fought for in the same way.
Precisely. It really highlights that critical point where their experiences of racism intercepted with the prevailing feminist narrative, leaving them feeling unseen and unheard, even in supposedly progressive spaces.
And for Hooks, this wasn't just like an accidental oversight.
No, she argued it was more fundamental. It demonstrated how racism and sexism aren't separate issues, but can actually intersect and reinforce each other, even within movements supposedly fighting against oppression.
Okay, but, and this is crucial, right, for Hooks, intersectionality wasn't just about pointing out the problems.
Absolutely not. She saw it fundamentally as a tool for change. It wasn't just an academic theory to analyze oppression.
It was a plan for action.
A practical framework, yeah, a way to actually dismantle those systems. Her vision for feminism was way broader than just ending sexism.
How so?
She saw feminism as a movement to end all interconnected systems of domination. That meant actively challenging racism, classism, economic inequality, colonialism, homophobia, transphobia, all of it, recognizing they're all linked.
It's a much bigger project.
It is. And she put it so powerfully. There's a quote from, I think, 1982, where she says, "Feminism is not simply a struggle to end male chauvinism. It is a commitment to eradicating the ideology of domination that permeates Western culture on various levels, sex, race, and class, to name a few."
Wow. Eradicating the ideology of dominations. That really broadens the scope.
It really does. And thinking like that, it naturally led Hooks to call for something specific, the creation of intersectional media.
Intersectional media. Okay, what does she mean by that? What was her vision for it?
Well, she strongly believed media could be used differently. She advocated for creating media that actively pushes back against all these forms of oppression. And crucially, media that provides a platform that actually amplifies the voices of those groups who've been historically marginalized or ignored.
Giving voice to the voiceless, essentially.
Or rather, recognizing the voices are there, but they haven't been given the microphone in mainstream spaces. So what were the specific aims of this kind of media from her perspective?
What should it do?
Well, first, it should explicitly show the connections between different types of oppression, like how sexism and racism work together, how class impacts experiences of gender, and so on. Make those links visible.
Okay, what else?
It should also actively challenge white male privilege. Not just ignore it, but expose how power is unfairly distributed in society, how that shapes whose stories get told and valued.
So making power structures visible.
Exactly. And related to that, exposing economic inequality, showing how things like wealth and social status directly impact who gets to be visible, who gets heard in the media landscape. It's not a level playing field.
Makes sense. And representation.
Absolutely fundamental, actively and authentically representing marginalized voices, particularly black women, given her focus, but also, LGBTQ plus folks, people with disabilities, other communities consistently underrepresented or misrepresented.
And it's not just about, like, ticking boxes for representation, is it?
No, not at all. Hooks really emphasized celebrating otherness, showing diverse identities and experiences not as problems or deviations from a norm, but as valuable, enriching parts of the human experience, things to be celebrated.
Okay, so pulling this all together then. Bell Hooks' contribution seems absolutely massive, helping us understand how race, gender, class, all these things intersect.
Definitely, especially focusing on how that intersection shapes the specific experiences of black women. And she just powerfully showed that media isn't neutral in all this.
Right. It's not just reflecting society.
No, it's an active force. It can either perpetuate those harmful stereotypes and power imbalances, or it can actively challenge them. It plays a huge role.
And what's so powerful, I think, is her belief that media can be a force for positive change. That's quite hopeful, isn't it?
It is. This deep-seated belief that by consciously challenging stereotypes, by actively amplifying marginalized voices, media can genuinely become a tool for liberation, a force for good.
Which really brings it back to all of us, to you listening. Understanding intersectionality, seeing how it works in the media you consume. It's not just, like, academic theory.
Not at all. It's really essential if you want to be truly informed, truly engaged with the world. It pushes us, doesn't it, to look critically at the films we watch, the news we read, the music we listen to.
Yeah, and to ask those questions, whose stories are being centered here? Whose perspectives are we getting?
And maybe even more importantly, whose stories are missing, whose voices are being silenced or ignored in this narrative. It changes how you consume media.
Definitely. So on that note, here's something to maybe mull over after this. Just imagine. Imagine what the media landscape could look like if these intersectional principles were truly, widely, intentionally adopted in creating TV shows, films, news, everything.
Yeah, think about that shift. Whose stories do you think would finally get the space, the nuance, the spotlight they've always deserved?